Okay, so welcome everybody to this webinar. It's great to be here with you. My name, as Delphine said, is Jon Cracknell, and together with my colleague Harriet, we run a consultancy. We work for a consultancy called thehourislate.com. And I'm really looking forward to getting your feedback on what we have found in this 5th edition of environmental funding by European foundations. So this is totally a kind of collective effort. I happen to be presenting the findings today, but this is a collective effort. I'm sorry if you can hear the phone going in the background, it'll stop in a moment. It's a collective effort by a big team from the European Foundation Centre. You can see Deborah Flon in the top left-hand corner of the photos here, and Sylvia, who you've just met. And both of them were absolutely instrumental to getting this research done. Deborah did a lot of the work to categorize the grants, and Sylvia to actually get them in the first place. And then other members of the EFC staff have been working really hard on producing the report. So it's a kind of collective team effort. And many of you contributed information about your grants and shared your grants lists. And I just want to say a big thank you to everybody who did that, because again, we couldn't do the research without your help. We hope that you will find this kind of a product that's going to be collectively useful for the sector. So just a quick overview of the presentation. I'm going to talk about the grants that we tracked and categorized in 4 different ways in terms of the thematic issue, so the top left-hand corner of that graphic, the geographical distribution of the grants, the kinds of approaches which environmental funders are prioritizing, the approaches to change. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the environmental discourses, or the values that seem to be driving people's grant making. And I'm only going to cover some of the top level findings today. There's a lot more detail in the report. I really encourage you to have a look at the report when the link is put into the chat. And one other thing it's worth saying is that we're now building up a bigger data set, as Delphine mentioned, and we're starting to be able to use that to look at the data on specific environmental issues, for specific groups of funders. So if that's of interest to you, then please let Sylvia know after the presentation. So this research is increasingly comprehensive, but it is still missing important funders. We're aware of foundations that should be in the data set and aren't. So if anything, these figures are slight underestimates. We're actually thinking of producing an additional report on climate philanthropy in Europe with the Climate Works Foundation in California, where we hope to address that problem, certainly where climate grant making is concerned. And as Delphine said, the field is expanding fast, and there are some large new funders who only started making grants since 2018. So please see this as a work in progress. And we really need your help to persuade other funders to take part in this research. So all of these grants that we're going to look at today were made in 2018, or for UK foundations, 2018 to 2019. And it's worth saying that 74 of the 127 foundations that I'm going to talk about are based in the UK. That's partly because there are a lot of environmental foundations in the UK, but also because their grants information is easy for us to access, because a lot of it is publicly available. And we only included foundations in the research if they had made more than 300,000, so 339,000 euros of environmental grants in 2018. That was the kind of bar to get included, with the exception of funders in Central and Eastern Europe. And we included those even if they were making slightly less than that in terms of the volume of grants. So we can see across the 5 editions that Delphine referred to how the coverage has grown from just 27 foundations in the first edition and 181 million euros of grants to now the 127 foundations that I just referred to, and a total of 745.6 million euros of environmental grants in 2018. So that seems like an encouraging development, but if you set that 745.6 million against the current best estimate for total philanthropy in Europe, it's just 1.2% of total European philanthropy. And as I say, the figure may be slightly higher than that, because of funders which were missing from the data set, but I'd be very surprised if it was much above 2% or 2.5%. And on the right-hand side, you can see a graphic from the recent really useful ClimateWorks Foundation report that Delphine referred to, where they tried to estimate what proportion of global philanthropy was going to climate work, and you can see the 2% dripping out at the bottom of the graphic. So I guess the question really is, are we going to be able to look our children and our grandchildren in the eye and tell them that we tried to do everything that we could while we had the opportunity to grapple both with biodiversity loss and climate change? You wouldn't say that the answer to that question is yes if you look at the small share which is still being directed towards this work. So just moving on to the thematic issues which are receiving the greatest amount of funding. So here we have broken the grants down from 2018 using the 13 broad thematic issue categories which we've used in the past, and these were agreed with grant maker networks in America, Canada, Australia, the UK, so that we have directly comparable data between different parts of the world. You can see at the top that climate and atmosphere remains the issue receiving the largest share of funding, 134 million euros, or about 18% of the total. And then there are three relatively large thematic issue categories: biodiversity and species, and then agriculture and food. And then we move to three that are very similar to each other: terrestrial ecosystems work, coastal and marine funding, and energy related funding. And then down on the right-hand side, you see a set of issues which we've referred to in the past as the Cinderella issues, that still receive relatively small shares of grants from environmental funders, despite the fact that they are really important drivers of environmental harm and damage. So if you think about consumption and waste and the amount that we currently overconsume and the way that that affects our environmental footprint, that's clearly really important in driving environmental harm. Transport is critical if we're going to tackle climate change. It's the sector of the European economy where emissions have been growing really fast, but it receives a lot less funding than the energy category or the climate and atmosphere category. Trade and finance policies are crucial. They kind of set the rules for the global economy. Or if you think of the incentives in the financial sector for banks, for insurers, for other investors, that's crucial in terms of determining what kinds of infrastructure we build and what kind of economic development we have. And these are all still small areas of activity in terms of funding by environmental foundations. And I think it's an open question whether we need to change that as we go forward. So it would be great to hear your views later in the chat or in the breakout rooms. So we look also in the report at a direct like-for-like comparison. So comparing 2016 to 2018, and we have data for 77 of the 127 foundations. We have data that directly compares from 2016 to 2018. And you can see here what happened to the changes in the funding between these different issues. So if there's a green plus symbol, it means that there was more grant making in 2018 than in 2016. And if there's the little red minus symbol, then the amount of funding fell back from 2016 to 2018. You can see a big uptick for climate and atmosphere. That is distorted to a certain extent by one very large grant that got made in 2018, but that it is, even taking that grant out, there's definitely growth between 2016 and 2018. You can see that agriculture and food was receiving more funding, coastal and marine issues, and some of the Cinderella issues that I referred to that are towards the bottom of the chart, so transport, consumption and waste, trade and finance, they had quite large increases in percentage terms, but from a very low level, from a very low base. So we welcome the percentage increases, but those still remain very much the Cinderella issues. So I'm just going to turn to geography, and then I'm going to break to see if there are any questions on this opening half of the presentation. So if we look at how the grants break down internationally, we can see that just over half, 52.1%, are supporting initiatives in Europe. The international category below is large, and that's all the grants which we know are supporting international work, but where we can't be sure exactly where the funding goes. So a good example would be a climate change project with think tanks in 4 different continents working together on climate policy, and you don't really know whether the funding went to the Latin American partner, the North American partner, the Asian partner, etc. And lots of conservation initiatives are like that too as well. They're sort of international conservation work. So that's what's in that category. I think it's interesting that Africa is the continent receiving the largest share of grants after Europe. So 9.3% of the grants. And you get a sort of strong sense of a kind of post-colonial kind of connections between European foundations and countries in Africa. I think that's part of what lies behind that. And then at the bottom of the table, you can see the 5.4% figure that Delphine referred to in her introduction. So these were the grants that we can see that are conspicuously supporting pan-European work, so allowing organizations to work across Europe from different countries. And 80% of the environmental legislation in EU member states is crafted in the EU institutions, and we're still at 5.4% of the grants supporting that kind of pan-European work. Now, there are really notable exceptions. Obviously, the likes of the European Climate Foundation and others are funding with a conspicuously pan-European outlook and kind of perspective. But by and large, I think it's true that there's a big gap between the way that foundations make their grants and the potential for sort of harnessing European leadership on the world stage or pushing for more ambition within the EU institutions. And part of the reason for that you can see in this chart, home and away. So this shows that on the left-hand side of the chart that 33 of the foundations were making less than 10% of their grants to projects in the country where the foundation's based. So these are the 33 are really kind of international, kind of globally minded funders, and they're funding outside the boundaries of the country where they're based. On the other side of the chart, you see 54 foundations where 90% or more than 90% of their grants are domestically focused and are supporting work sort of at home, if you like. That's slightly overemphasized, the 54 figure, because for some foundations we only have a few grants to judge by, but I think it's a true picture. And you can see that there are relatively few foundations in the middle that are doing both these things. So European environmental foundations tend to break into either one group or the other group. And I think that has some important consequences for how people understand effective grant making. I also then just picked out the 30 European countries, and here in the table, I'm afraid there's a rather lot of information, but I'm just going to, there's only one bit that I think is really important to concentrate on. Here in the table, I've expressed the grants that are going to each of these countries in terms of their population. So you can see highlighted in yellow the number of euros per 100 people that are going to each of the countries. You have to do it per 100 people, otherwise the figures get so small it's very difficult to compare them. So you can see how Denmark and the Netherlands dominate this list when you look at the grant making on a per capita basis. You've then got another 4 countries where there's more than €1 per person of environment grants. That's another way of saying 100 euros for 100 people, €1 per person in 2018. And then a long tail starting with Italy and going down the table to Malta at the bottom. And I've picked out the new member states of the European Union that joined after 2000 or 2004 in the kind of orangey salmon type color. And you can see that nearly all of them are in the second half of the table, and they have tiny amounts of funding being directed towards them. We've commented on this in past editions. It's still a real problem, I think. These are countries which are trying to build stronger civil society organizations in the environment sector. You know, it takes a long time to do that, it takes decades to do that, and they've only been trying to do it since 1989 or after 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down, and they receive very little support still from environmental grants from foundations. And I think that's an important question for us to think about as a sector collectively, whether we could do something to change that in the future. And then final slide in this section, we've also looked for the first time in this report at the 8 countries that were making the most grants. As we're starting to get more data, we're able to start to look at the way that grants are being made from particular countries rather than which countries are they going to. And it's not surprising that the United Kingdom comes at the top of this list, given the 74 foundations that I mentioned, more than 2,000 grants from those foundations, worth more than 246 million euros. If you look at the Swiss line and the figure that I picked out in yellow, you can see how internationally minded Swiss foundations are. That figure is again slightly distorted by the large climate change grant that I referred to, but even without that grant, you would find that Swiss foundations are very internationally minded. So just 6.5% of the grants supporting work in Switzerland. And then if you look at the line for Italy, you see completely the reverse situation. So Italian foundations, as a result of the way that they are structured, are funding projects close to where they're based generally. So all of their grants are staying in the country, in Italy. France, I picked out the large number of grants in France too as well, because that's strikingly high, 1,019. And then on the right-hand side, in the right-hand column, we're able to start looking at which thematic issues are receiving the most support from foundations in each country. This is rather provisional, this data, but we can see that Danish and Italian foundations are making large shares of their grants to the sustainable communities category. So that's initiatives that are happening, as the name suggests, at a community level, often in urban areas. So it might be community green spaces and parks, or food growing workshops and local food growing projects, or the installation of solar panels on schools or other community buildings, for example. In France, you can see that agriculture and food is a high priority, not surprising, I guess, in a way. And in Germany, interestingly, transport is the thematic issue receiving the most funding. That's a consequence of the grants from one of the larger German foundations being focused in that area. Talk very quickly about the approaches that foundations are using to try and affect change, and then more about the values, discourses which they are working in. So just in terms of approaches, this, for the first time this year in this volume of the research, we thought we would try and develop a taxonomy of approaches. You can see the categories on the left-hand side of the chart here. Many of them will be familiar to you. And we looked at the grants from all the foundations, and for 110 of the 127 foundations, we were fairly confident that we could assign them to up to 2 of these approach categories. So looking across the grants that they were making, what was the main way which they were trying to affect change through their grants? And you can see that hands-on conservation came top, followed by advocacy and research. And it's striking, I think, how much funding is being directed towards research of one kind or another. Then environmental education initiatives, and lots of community and amenity focused projects. Those were in that sustainable communities category that I mentioned earlier. And then you can see that there's some corporate campaigning being supported, work on sort of trying to deliver solutions. So actually get the solar panels up on the roof, for example, or support the food waste initiative, that kind of service delivery, and then things tail off rapidly after that point. And then the final kind of lens that I want to use to look at the grants is to talk a bit about environmental discourses. This is a little bit more complicated to explain. Discourses or values. And again, this is experimental. It's the first time that we have tried to break the grants down based on the kind of values that funders bring to their work. So I'm going to take a few minutes to explain what we're trying to show in this diagram here. So here on the screen, you can see a graphic with 7 different discourses of environmentalism. And to develop these, we've drawn on lots of great academic research that's been done over the years into the way that environment groups work. The first 3 of these discourses, so above the solid blue line, we kind of characterize as mainstream. And then the other 4 as more alternative. And I'm going to say a little bit about each one of them in turn. And you can see with the arrow going around at the side of the graphic, as you move through these different discourses, the kind of focus shifts from conserving the natural world to changing, more and more radical change, basically, at the bottom of the diagram. So just talking about the discourses, practical conservation work will be very familiar to all of you on the call, I think, protecting species and habitats, conserving the natural world. In the market transformation discourse, people are really trying to develop market-based alternatives to regulation, often with new technology involved or voluntary industry standards and certification or green consumerism. So, you know, using your fabric shopping bag rather than a plastic bag, for instance, or buying organic. In the state-led regulation discourse, again, it'll be very familiar to you. That's really sort of about using policy and legislation to set signals for the market. So polluter pays, cost-benefit analysis, kind of concepts that you'll be familiar with. And the sort of social and political change there is quite incremental usually. It's sort of within the art of what's politically possible at the moment, if you like. When we move into the more alternative discourses on the other side of the blue line, the next one we've called deeper systems change, because that's really work that looks for kind of much deeper paradigm shifts in whole sectors of the economy, like food, energy, transport. So it's becoming more kind of ambitious, politically and socially. So just to give you a sort of contrast, in the market transformation scheme, you might be encouraging people to buy carbon offsets when they take a flight somewhere, whereas a campaign group in the deeper systems change discourse might be questioning whether we need aviation expansion at all, trying to change transport policy to stop flights altogether or to stop new airports being constructed. So just to give a sense of the difference. When you move into the one planet and fair shares discourse, you're starting to explicitly think about the limits to economic growth, the need to reduce inequality, both within countries and between generations too, as well. So this is where concerns about curbing consumption, redistributing resources, human well-being start to become more and more central. And then in the environmental justice discourse, people are concerned about environmental racism, indigenous communities, for example, and the harm which is done to them, and concepts around rights and justice and empowerment are becoming more and more important the whole way as you move down through these discourses, also around power and around political change in the way that democracy is practiced, the way that kind of democracy is carried out. That becomes more and more of a priority. And clearly in the environmental justice discourse, there's huge concern about the loss of life amongst environmental defenders around the world, particularly from indigenous communities. And this discourse is a real priority for the incoming Biden administration in the US. And then finally, there's what we've called revolutionary discourse, that's really sort of challenging capitalism itself more, and trying to take back power from corporations and unaccountable elites, if you like. System change, not climate change. Here you have networks of activists, kind of global protest communities. And I think we're all pretty familiar with how that plays out in practice. So we tried to put as many of the foundations as we could into one of these, to categorize them by the discourse which they're working in. And we did this by looking at all the grants which they made and looking at their websites and their annual reports where that was helpful. And we did this for 110 of the 127 foundations again. And it's an experiment. We're trying this out, and if you find this useful, a useful way of thinking about grant making, then we can refine it and develop it more. But this is kind of a work in progress. And this is what happens if you break down the grants from the 110 foundations between those different discourses. You can see that 72%, just under 73%, are in those three more mainstream discourses. So the practical conservation work is the largest one. That's not a surprise, I think. Just under 37%. Then there's the market transformation discourse, and then lots of funding in state-led regulation and sort of practical inside track policy work, if you like. Then when we move into the more alternative discourses below the blue line, we see that the shares of funding start to drop quite fast until we get down to environmental justice with just 0.5% of the grants falling in that discourse, and then the revolutionary discourse at the bottom, 0.2%. And I guess the kind of question I would have, it would be great to hear your feedback in the breakouts and in the chat, is this a right balance? Do we need to be moving as funders more towards the more alternative and radical discourses, taking up Delphine's challenge from her opening comments? Lots of the energy in the environment movement at the moment is coming from younger campaigners, from student strikes, or from a coming together, for example, in the United States, of the movement for Black Lives and the climate movement. And I guess my kind of question is, are we in danger of falling behind the curve as funders? We've got less than 10 years to try and curb climate change and cope with biodiversity loss. Do we need to be changing the way in which we do our grants and taking more risk, to Delphine's point? Our philanthropic capital is incredibly flexible. It can fund things that's very hard to get funded from anywhere else, that governments won't fund, that corporations won't fund, that it can be hard to raise money from members of the public. And I just wonder whether we are far enough down the discourse ladder, if you like, given the urgency of the issues which confront us. It would be great to get your feedback on that. So bringing all of this together, and this is the final section and slide pretty much in the deck, we again have experimented in this edition of the research with trying to create profiles of 5 different types of environmental foundations. And these take elements from the 4 things I've been talking about, from the thematic issues, from the geography, from the approaches, and from the discourse analysis that I was just talking about. And we kind of melded them together to try to identify 5 different groups of foundations who have quite different understandings of what it is to be effective. So first of all, you have issue specialists at the top of the table. As the name suggests, they are very focused on 1 or 2 thematic issues. So for example, biodiversity and species and terrestrial ecosystems, or climate change and energy, for instance. And they account for 1/5 of the grants. And as I noted earlier, there aren't very many issue specialists focused on those Cinderella issues, the ones which receive relatively small shares of funding. So that's a question. We'd love to get your feedback on whether it would be good if there were more specialist funders in those Cinderella issues. The next group, the largest share of the funding, are the complete opposite, gift-giving foundations, where it's hard to really discern a strategy when you look at their grants, any very clear strategy. They make grants on lots of different issues, often to lots of different organizations. And they are the largest share, the largest group. And whether this is a good thing or a bad thing again, it would be great to get your thoughts in the breakouts. You could say this is a really good thing that they fund that way, because this is like the flexible sort of swing capital that is needed for new opportunities and threats, or to get new organizations off the ground. It's often philanthropic grants that concede startups. So it's important to have that kind of flexibility. Or you could say, actually, it's a problem if this amount of money is being sort of spread far and wide, and it could be contributing to fragmentation within the environment movement and environment sector. That's an interesting debate, I think. The third group are what we've dubbed the disruptors. And there are 22 of them out of the 127 foundations, and they are actively trying to disrupt the status quo. And you can see what a large share of their grants are being directed towards tackling climate change. So the categories climate, energy, and transport here. And you can also see that they are very internationally minded. They don't really fund things in their home country, the 5.2% on the right-hand side. Then there's a set of local funders who are, as the name suggests, funding things close to where they are based, or in the country where they're based, 19 of those. And then finally, a set of research funders, and they are really defined by the fact that they are, as the name suggests, supporting academic research of one kind or another. So lots of PhD studentships, for example, or bigger scientific research projects in climate science, for instance. And they're kind of a distinct group of funders, I think, that can be sort of identified. So again, your kind of reactions after the call and when you've had a chance to look at the report would be brilliant. Is this useful to think of different types of environmental funder, and how could we develop these kinds of categories so that they're more helpful to you in your work? Let us know, please. So that's it. I'm going to stop, and I think we're going to have some breakout rooms. You can reach me on that email address, john@theirislake.com, and Sylvia on her email. And we would absolutely love to hear from you after the call with any queries that you have or suggestions about how to develop this and make it better. And if you can help us to reach new funders, that would be extremely useful. So thank you.